Stepan Bandera, for Ukraine a hero, for Poland the architect of mass murder. The Russo-Ukrainian war is still ongoing, and so is the debate about the 1943 massacres. Polish and Ukrainian interpretations of the Volhynia massacres seem to be as polarized as ever. We understand Ukraine's current predicament, but in all this, where is historical accuracy? Join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
Across centuries, Poles and Ukrainians lived side by side, for better or worse, building a difficult friendship, one at times tainted by bloodshed. It's 1863. The January uprising has broken out, engulfing the entire territory of the Russian partition of Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus and Ukraine, including Volhynia. Considerable numbers of Ukrainian intelligentsia and some Ukrainian Cossacks fight alongside Poles for, as the slogan had it, our freedom and yours. Later, our nations, Poles and Ukrainians, seized the momentum of post-World War I havoc. Ukraine, as the Ukrainian People's Republic, proclaimed independence in January 1918. Poland regained its own in November 1918. We had a common foe, Bolshevik Russia, with its Red Army heading west to plant the red standard of communism in Europe. Under the Treaty of Warsaw, signed by Polish and Ukrainian leaders Józef Piłsudski and Szymon Petlura, Poland annexed Galicia, the western portions of the Volhynian Governorate, and other territories. In exchange, Poland recognized the Ukrainian People's Republic and aided troops in retaking Kyiv. But after the Polish-Soviet Treaty of Riga in 1921, Ukrainian territory found itself split between the Ukrainian SSR in the east and Poland in the west. Although Ukraine was abandoned by Poland, Petlura was not. He hid out in an apartment belonging to Piłsudski's close ally Henryk Józefski, dodging Soviet calls for Poland to extradite him. Józefski, who held the office of Volhynian regional governor from 1930 until 1938, concentrated on improving relations between the Polish government and the local Ukrainian majority. He advocated a broad autonomy for Ukrainian self-governance, promoted Ukrainians to administrative posts, and fostered Ukrainian and Polish-Ukrainian organizations. He made teaching of the Ukrainian language mandatory at Volhynian schools and sought to introduce Ukrainian as an official language in the province. While in the 1930s there had been hopes for a Polish-Ukrainian coexistence, the advent of World War II dashed them, and it was bloody.
I'm delighted to welcome today Dr. Paweł Markiewicz. He's a historian and the Executive Director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Welcome to the programme.
Thanks so much for having me.
The clip there seemed to suggest a Polish view of Polish-Ukrainian relations. How did Ukraine see or start to see itself in this time frame, the 19th century?
Well, I think it's important to understand that this was about the time where a strong Ukrainian national awakening was taking place. In the Galician lands that were under the control of the Habsburg Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was later in coming in comparison to Poland's national awakening, which was always very strong and prevalent, but it was still something that was becoming visible and recognized not only by the Austro-Hungarians but also by Poles as well. It's interesting to note that we talked about, or the clip talked about, the similarities between Poles and Ukrainians. It's all that needs to be seen is going to their national anthems. The first stanza, the opening stanza to both national anthems, is identical. It says that Poland or Ukraine is not yet lost. So we saw these similarities on that level. The Ukrainian national awakening, which was taking place, was certainly something that formed the basis, the embryo for their future kind of ethnic development in this part of the world, in this part of Europe.
And how did the two views of history diverge? The Ukraine in the early years in the 1920s of the 20th century developed the Bandera, if we can call it, just shorthand, Bandera version of history, nationalist, ethnically pure Ukraine. Was that the only strand in Ukrainian historiography, or were there other ways of seeing Ukraine as a nation in that time?
Well, I think it was certainly the most dominant one at that time. And the way it developed certainly has to do with how World War I played out, which was very important for these nations. Many of the smaller nations in Central and Eastern Europe that were vying for their independence, Poles and Ukrainians, of course, among them. Kind of the trajectory that happened was almost very parallel. So Polish units fought within the larger powers, so the Polish legions in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Similar Ukrainian units fought alongside in those types of formations as well. The problem that emerged was that the Poles achieved what they sought for 123 years, which was the reemergence of an independent state. The Ukrainians didn't get that. They didn't get the independent state that they so wanted and desired. And this is where a lot of the friction that emerged after World War I between Poles and Ukrainians, in interwar Poland especially, is rooted. So we had what we saw in the clip as well, Polish rule over Eastern Galicia, or what Poland at that time called its Western Little Poland. So Lwów being a very important cultural center, and the areas around it. These areas were Polonized, so you had a lot of the intelligentsia in the cities. It was predominantly Polish and Jewish as well, but predominantly Polish. While in the countryside you had the Ukrainians. And there was a very bitter taste in the mouth of some of the Ukrainians, especially the Ukrainians that fought within those military formations during the First World War and didn't get what they sought to get. And here you had the basis of the nationalist movement that formed in the interwar period. So the organization of Ukrainian nationalists sprang up from the disenchantment felt by these veterans from World War I.
Was Poland seen as the enemy number one, or was there a Russian element to it as well? You have the the Bolshevik revanchist policy coming in the 1920s again. How did Ukrainian nationalists see? Was it just too coherent and equal enemies? How did they?
Well, I think an interesting dichotomy emerged in the interwar period. Certainly, the Soviet Russia, the Bolsheviks were an enemy right off the bat. But then afterwards, kind of a shift happened, where a lot of those territories that I mentioned fell into the interwar Polish state. But not only, of course, we have to remember that Ukrainian territory also fell into the reborn Czechoslovak state and in reborn Romania. But again, it was Poland with the policies enacted by certain governments, focusing on a very kind of heavy-handed assimilation at some points against the Ukrainian population, which fomented a lot of their displeasure towards the Polish state. While you had on the other side, the logic kind of went that, well, there is a Ukrainian state to the east, farther east, even though it's a kind of Soviet republic, but the Ukrainian language was permitted there. Ukrainian kind of ethnic development was permitted to a certain degree. So it was kind of a dichotomy where you had at one time, the communist Soviet side was seen as a very bitter enemy, but then it was seen as somewhat
more benign.
More benign, since it gave the Ukrainians a little bit of what they wanted, a little taste of some kind of freedom, let's call it.
This internationalist ideology outlook, I suppose. What was so if you're a Ukrainian nationalist based in Western Ukraine, where do the boundaries of a perceived Ukrainian state lie? Okay, we have Poland butting to the west. What about the east? Where does that go?
It's very interesting, kind of studying a little bit of that mindset and logic that I had the pleasure of doing. That vision of an ethnographic Ukraine was very wide and expansive. So maybe starting from the western side, So not just kind of Lviv and what we have or perceive as Western Ukraine today, but a lot of the radical nationalists claimed, for example, Przemysl, those areas to be part of historic Ukraine. They claimed Chełm and those parts of Western Lublin region to be part of historical Ukraine. And then farther east, they claimed areas around the Don region, so the Don Cossack region in what is today Russia, as part of ethnographic Ukraine. Even going so far as to claim areas in Kazakhstan where there was some kind of a Ukrainian presence that could be claimed as Ukrainian. So this was a very wide vision of the Ukrainian ethnographic state.
And was this developed by historians or politicians?
It was developed by historians, geographers, intellectual thinkers, philosophers. So it was not just politicians, what we could think of politicians today. Right? These kind of scientific studies were used by many of the leading nationalists that appeared on the Ukrainian national scene for kind of their vision of what Ukraine should be, right? Because they never had that vision, or they didn't remember maybe that vision, right? These were generations from the Khmelnytsky kind of Cossack state, or even going further to Kievan Rus, right? This is something they only read about. Whereas on the flip side, Poles, they had kind of an understanding for generations, right? Even in the partition period.
Documents and...
There were documents, and it was generation from generation was passed on that Poland used to have these territories, right? It was this large, and it went span from the Baltic to the Black Sea.
We'll bring our discussion up to date to the Volhynia massacres, and we'll discuss that after our next clip.
As the fires of World War II raged on, many Ukrainians saw an opportunity to once again renew their struggle for independence. This time around, however, influenced by Stepan Bandera's radical and fascist ideology, some perceived Poles as obstacles that could be eliminated through ethnic cleansing. The ground for such radical solutions was ripe. With Henryk Józefski dismissed from his post as the governor of Volhynia in 1938, the Polish government reversed many of his policies and intensified repression of Ukrainian institutions, churches and schools. Flaunting its wealth in front of much poorer Ukrainian peasants, some of the privileged Polish gentry was disinterested in educating the Ukrainian population or supporting the schooling of Ukrainian children. Dispersed across rural Volhynia and Galicia, stripped of leadership by Soviet repression and lacking protection, entire Polish families began to be systematically wiped out. Poles were buried alive, flayed, impaled, crucified, disemboweled, dismembered, and beheaded. The Ukrainians would not spare women either. Pregnant women were gang raped and had their breasts cut off. Children were hacked to pieces with axes. Babies were impaled on bayonets and pitchforks or bashed against trees. Estimates of the Polish death toll ranges from 30,000 to 130,000, including several hundred Ukrainians and Jews who risked their lives to protect the Poles. Several thousand Ukrainian partisans were killed in Polish retaliatory action. Since Poland and Ukraine regained their places on the world map in the late 20th century, a number of symbolic acts of goodwill have been noted. In July 2023, Polish President Andrzej Duda and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky held a joint remembrance ceremony in Volhynia, where Zelensky thanked Poles for their support and expressed sorrow for the past tragedies. But the Volhynian and Galician soil still holds unburied remains of Polish victims. A dignified burial has been a priority for Poland's diplomatic efforts.
The remains of these people call for a Christian burial. It's an absolute must, not a political matter.
There's hope for accomplishing this. Following Ukraine's approval, exhumations began in the now non-existent village of Późniki, where at least 42 bodies were uncovered. Just last Wednesday, Poland received a second approval for exhumations, this time in the former village of Zbojska. Remembering the victims is of utmost importance. For this reason, in early June, Poland's lower house of parliament passed a law to establish July 11th as a national day of remembrance for Polish victims of genocide committed by Ukrainian nationalists.
Is there anything in the nature of Bandera's ideology, this Ukrainian nationalist ideology, that can account for the virulence of these massacres, or is it in the context of World War II where untold horrors happened? Is this part and parcel of the course of that particular history?
I think it's a mix, kind of looking at what was written by many of these nationalist, radical nationalist ideologues that inspired men like Bandera and those close to him, along with the conflict of the Second World War. These are kind of two tectonic plates that shifted in the right spot, so to speak. So you had, in a lot of the rhetoric that was written by the Ukrainian nationalist ideologues, these ideas of a Ukrainian state for Ukrainians, eliminating perceived enemies, Poles, Russians, Hungarians, Jews as well, in any type of form possible, right? As long as they're off our land, mixed with witnessing the atrocities of the Second World War. So the roundups, the massacres by the Germans. This was almost seen by many of these radical nationalist ideologues as the quickest, easiest, and perhaps even most complicit way of handling this issue, especially seeing that Poles were enemies of the Nazi Germans at that time. And it kind of coincided and could fit in quite well with the German perception and vision of what they wanted to do on the occupied lands, and the radical Ukrainian nationalist hopes, which was to perhaps have some kind of an autonomous region on their ethnic territories under Nazi German occupation, that, or from which a future Ukrainian state could emerge, depending on the way the war went.
Yes, I mean, playing the German card, it was, I suppose, a traditional thing in Eastern Europe, isn't it? You always leapfrog over your main enemy. Was this perceived after the Second World War as a failure of Ukrainian nationalist policy, or was it something that Ukrainian nationalists, émigré Ukrainian nationalists, wanted to keep alive as a pure, once more, we need to redouble our efforts to have this pure Ukraine?
Well, I think it was, a lot had to do with the latter of what you mentioned. And of course, once again, the way the war transpired certainly helped that, in that the Ukrainian territories, or the lands of current Ukraine, were immediately reoccupied by the Soviet Union, which made the role of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists in émigré, in exile, headquartered in Germany, all the more important in that their goal now was to eject the enemy, which was the Soviet occupation rather than the Polish occupation. So their kind of perceived enemy just switched once again, given the circumstances on the ground.
And how did they treat the Volhynia massacres? If we assume the figures are accurate, 100,000 Poles, Jews, Czechs are murdered. Okay, Russia was the number one enemy post-war. What happened to this episode? Was it just conveniently forgotten? Was there kind of an amnesia about what the ideology led to? Because Russia was the main, right. Soviet Russia was the main enemy.
Right, and given the fact that Soviet Russia was the main enemy not only of Ukrainians and Poles, but also of the United States and Western Europe, it kind of fit in quite nicely to cover things up or not have to mention them. I think Volhynia in this kind of context was one of those unfortunate events that was simply brushed kind of, as you mentioned, under the rug, right? If no one's talking about it, why mention it? Because it's certainly not something to be proud of, given the different circumstances. So it was something that wasn't mentioned in these circles. Looking at kind of the research that I did, on these Ukrainian nationalist thinkers. One of the things that came up, at least from my end, was the notion of a narrative, a post-war narrative, and how to describe Polish-Ukrainian relations. So certainly there was no mention of the fact that for quite some time the organization of Ukrainian nationalists worked very closely with Nazi Germany at various levels in the general government, especially when it came to seeking their desires or going against Poles in certain regions. The narrative that a lot of these wartime nationalists came up with was to show that this was a common incident, right? It wasn't something that started because from a fault of the Ukrainian side, but it was something that was built up that Poles and Ukrainians were were complicit at the same level. Let's put it that way, rather than having one over the other. Yeah. Exactly. To show that, well, our response kind of in the Volhynia and in these types of Eastern Galicia, these brutal massacres, was to what the Poles did to us. Yeah. So this tit for tat, right?
And then after post-war, you have Operation Vistula, the ethnic cleansing of Ukrainians from the homes. And so, as you say, this kind of quid pro quo
right.
Type of mentality. But what's the modern Ukrainian nationalists must be in a bit of a bind, in that we have monuments to Stepan Bandera, being erected chiefly over in Western Ukraine. On the one hand, hero of the UPA, of the nationalist fight against Russia, the main enemy, which is
right.
Now, and yet the Poles still prodding the Ukrainians about the Volhynia massacres. They can't have it both ways, can they?
Yeah, that's very tough.
To admit that would be to hit at their creation myth, I suppose.
Exactly, and being sandwiched between Poland on the one side and Russia on the other side makes it all the more difficult, especially given the current circumstances. Looking at Bandera and the whole Bandera myth, OUN, UPA, just through the prism of an anti-Russian, anti-Soviet context is certainly important at the moment, right? Because it kind of can band some of the Ukrainians together in their fight and their struggle against Russia. However, the flip side also needs to be looked at, needs to be examined much more broadly and openly, especially publicly, I think, which is the bad side of the Bandera and OUN, UPA myth, as you mentioned. I think one of the things that the Ukrainian side needs to understand is that, at least in Poland, in some parts of Poland, there are monuments to some of those OUN, UPA regiments where Ukrainians could lay flowers to the dead. While on the flip side, in Volhynia, none of the villages exist. So Polish representatives can't lay flowers at monuments. They're just fields. Whereas there's no sign of these villages anymore. And that's something that certainly bothers the Polish spirit inside to this day.
Is it accurate to say there's a cult of Bandera to inspire them against Russia? Is that getting stronger, or are there new national heroes who have arisen from this war to inspire them?
I think
are they just reaching into the past still?
I think in Western Ukraine, as you mentioned, where the most Bandera statues exist, that'll always be kind of a heartland for the Bandera following. But I think since February 2022, there's a whole new slate of Ukrainian heroes that the Ukrainian nation can build a historical national narrative around. It doesn't have to go to Bandera. Bandera tends to also be regional, right? Focused primarily in that pocket of Western Ukraine. We saw in the past some Ukrainian politicians trying to reach even more so to that electorate, naming streets in Kyiv after Bandera, which is something that would many, many decades ago be unimaginable, that influence wouldn't reach that far. Or even, trying to maybe, glorify Bandera as a hero, right, of Ukraine, which was done in the past as well. I think that now a whole new slate of Ukrainian heroes will emerge, which will put to rest a little bit the lingering shadow of Bandera over Ukraine.
A final question, coming on from that comment that you've just made, how do you gauge Polish-Ukrainian relations?
I think that wishful thinking would be to see common interests overtake petty squabbles, especially given the fact that the past, the very difficult past that we've discussed and we've saw in the clips here between Poles and Ukrainians, is very easy for Russia to use and manipulate. And that tends to be the problem when it comes to this question of the relationship between the two. I think that once both sides come to the conclusion and agreement that, in fact, reconciling the past would show Russia, the Kremlin, whoever's sitting there, that these two nations are mature, they can speak to one another about very difficult problems, but they can also cooperate with each other where interests combine. I think that would be the most important signal to send.
On that note, Dr. Markiewicz, we have to leave. Thank you very much for coming onto our programme.
Thank you so much.
That's it. Thank you very much. And do join us next time. You know the time, Tuesdays, 9:35 p.m, 21:35 CEST. Join us then.